All right, let me share something. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I had a young lady come bouncing into church one day. She must have been in her early 20s, and you know one of those where they come in, they're all excited, and she kind of goes like this, and she lands right in front of him, and she goes, "Remember me?" I thought, no. But of course you can't say that, and so I'm like, all right, and you can tell she's waiting, and I'm like, I got nothing. And she says, "Oh, you taught me in Sunday school in the 6th grade." Oh, yeah. Have you ever had that? Where you hadn't seen someone in like 10 or 15 years, and then you see them and you're like, they're just not the same person, right? Especially if they were little and they grew up, you're like, oh my goodness, you're a totally new person. But you've seen this with other people, right? Where they were like significantly overweight, then you don't see them for a year, and they lose like 60 pounds, and you see them again, and what do you say? "I hardly recognized you." That's right, because they've changed so much, right? There's other times where, people go back to their high school reunions and they were the reckless person who did all kinds of stuff, and now they're kind of put together and they are a totally different person. You're like, man, I don't even recognize you. Well, why? Because life is all about change. So I want to do an exercise with you this morning. I want you to think back to where you were 5 years ago. Okay, so whatever age you're at now, kind of backtrack in your mind, rewind the reel about 5 years, right? So if you're 50 now, you were 45. If you were 15, you're 10. If you're 95 now, okay, well, whatever. Okay, I'm kidding. Everybody changes. So just think back 5 years, and I want you to think this. Oh, here we go. How have you changed since that time? Now, to be more specific, how have you changed physically? Just think about it. What were you like 5 years ago for where you are today? Are you skinnier? Less skinny? More white hair? Fitter? Less fit? 2 artificial knees where you didn't have those before? Right? Just think back. Like, what's changed in there, right? Kind of make a note of that. Now, move on. How have you changed mentally or emotionally? In other words, think back 5 years ago, the kind of person you were. Are you a more optimistic person? Less optimistic person? Are you, did you learn stuff? Like, are you more learned in a subject? Did you do something? Did you go through a class? Did you try something? Is there something new? Like, just think, like, what is that for you? What about relationally? How have you changed relationally? In other words, do you have more friends? Fewer friends? What's a friend you have today or a relationship you had today that if you think back 5 years, didn't even exist? You didn't even know that person. And now it's something new. What about spiritually? Again, think back 5 years ago. Where were you? For me, that was when I was 50. Are you closer to God? Are you further from God? Have you gone forward? Have you gone backwards? Where do you feel like you're a different person? See, by the way, this is a great exercise to do. I would encourage you to do this. If you have someone close in your life, a spouse or a family member, when you go home and you have lunch today, ask them this question: how have I changed in the last 5 years? And let them tell you. Because sometimes change is a little hard to see in yourself. But they see it, and they'll say, oh, yeah. My wife said to me recently, you didn't used to be like that. We were talking about a particular topic. She said, you never used to say that. And I went, you're right. And I didn't even pay attention, right? We change. And sometimes we're the architects of those changes. In other words, we decide, I'm going to do something, I'm going to invest in myself, I'm going to go to a conference, I'm going to get fit. And so we actually start the change. Sometimes change is kind of thrust upon us. You know how that is, right? You have a heart attack and you're like, okay, if I don't do something different, I'm going to die. And so you begin to change, you do something different. Or, you're forced because of a relationship blow up and all of a sudden you have to do something new. So sometimes it seems reactive and haphazard, sometimes it's planned, but change is always a part of life. Now, why am I saying all that? Because we've always said that at ARAC, we want to be a people who invite other people to come as they are and be changed, right? That's kind of the whole thing. We talk about it, and the key word in here is change. And since we're at the start of a new year, I thought it'd be appropriate for us to spend the next 4 weeks, leading up to the celebration service, talking about where we're heading as a church. What does that look like personally as well as corporately? Because change is going to happen whether you want it to or not, so why not own and be the architects of change in our lives, as opposed to letting it just happen to us. We say in our church, at a corporate level, that change looks like this. We want to be a church that loves God, right? That's our vertical relationship with God. But we also want to be a people that are changed in how we love each other, which is the people around us in our church, and love the world, the people around us who don't yet know Jesus, right? They're all components. They're all come from the commands Jesus gave, which was love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? You remember that? And then he says, oh, and by the way, equally important is love your neighbor as yourself, right? Up, in, and then right before he left, he said, I want you to go in all the world making disciples of everybody. That's your mandate. It's your mission. It's why you exist, is to go do that. And so that's what we call it loving God, loving the world, and loving each other. And so we're going to explore those in the next 3 weeks. We're going to go in there a little more deeply in what that looks like. What's that picture? What does it look like if you're a disciple who's loving God? What does it look like to be a disciple who's loving the people around me? And what does it look like if I'm a disciple who's loving the world? But today, I kind of want to go through the why this matters, right? Because you could hear everything I'm going to say, and I'm going to do this, by the way, every year that I'm here. We're going to talk about this kind of thing. You might say, okay, I get it. Well, yeah, we're supposed to go up, in and out, and but why does this matter? Why does Jesus even care? And so I'm going to go back to a statement he said. It's a statement that he made at the end of his life. It's a statement Jesus made that, in my mind, is a little bit scary because it is absolutely crystal clear as to why we do what we do. We find the statement in John 14. We're going to be in John and a little bit in 1 John, two different books in the Bible written by the same guy. And this statement comes because he had just gotten to the place where he's at the Last Supper, right, where we're going to actually celebrate, and he's just told them two things. He said, one of you is going to betray me, and one of you is going to deny you even know me. And if you remember the story, the disciples were really bothered by this. They were troubled by this. Like, is this going to be me, Lord? I mean, this going to be, they couldn't figure this out. They said, we're going to stick with you till the very end. And so they were a little bit discouraged. And so Jesus has just kind of gone through, says, well, let me give you some encouragement. And so we read this. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Guys, I know this is bothering you. Just relax. Don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, right? We've been spending this whole time believing in God. Believe also in me. In other words, put your eyes on me. Trust me, right? You've spent 3+ years with me. Just trust me. And he proceeded to say, by the way, just to prove that, I'm actually, when I leave, I'm going to prepare a place for you. You remember this famous statement where he talks, I'm going to my Father's house. It's with many rooms. I'm going to actually have a place ready for you. So, like, you don't need to be discouraged because I'm leaving, but I'm making it ready for you guys. And then he goes on to give them this amazing promise. Very truly, I tell you, by the way, I'm going to do all this, and just so you guys know, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. In other words, yeah, I'm leaving, but this is not bad news. You guys are going to do amazing things as you follow me. Just believe in me. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. I mean, this is pretty encouraging stuff, right? Jesus is laying this out there. It's pretty amazing. He says, look, if you're a disciple of me, not only am I guaranteeing you this amazing eternity where I'm preparing a place for you, it's going to be fantastic and more than you could ever imagine, but while you live here, it's also going to be amazing because you're going to do all these things and I'm going to actually be with you and you're going to ask me for stuff and I'm going to do it. Amazing. And if he had stopped right there, most of us would feel pretty awesome about this. But because Jesus is Jesus, he didn't stop there. And I want you to take a look at his next statement. If you love me, keep my commands. Think about this for a second. Let it sink in. See, it's really easy to think that we love Jesus because we accept him into our hearts, and now we pray, and we sing, and we read our Bibles. That's not what he says. If you love me, keep my commands. Do you understand the implication, right? If we don't keep his commands, we don't love him. That means a follower, a disciple, someone who follows Jesus, what we're going to be talking about for the next 3 weeks, is not somebody who prayed a prayer to accept Jesus into their heart or just believes intellectually that he is God or anything like that. A follower, a disciple of Jesus is someone who lives the ways of Jesus. That's what Jesus is talking about. It's really clear, and it's kind of a little scary. But there could be some encouragement in this as well. So, to put in words that maybe we don't often like, is to love Jesus is to obey Jesus. You want to love Jesus? Obey him. There's no in-between. There's no middle ground. Jesus says, if you love me, then you're going to do what I tell you to do. And by the way, this was not like the Pharisees. Like the Pharisees, they made it all about rules, right? Because that's kind of what this sounds like. Jesus is saying, well, just do all the things I tell you to do and you'll earn my love. No, that's what the Pharisees tried to do. They tried to say, well, if I follow every rule, every regulation, do everything the way I'm going to do it, then God will approve of me and approve of us as a nation. Jesus criticized that totally. He's like, no, that's not it at all. What I'm trying to tell you is this, that if you have a relationship with me where you love me, you will obey me. So actually, on a positive side, you could think of this way. As you lean in, as you obey Jesus, it's a way of saying, yeah, I love Jesus. I wouldn't be doing this otherwise. It's kind of the same as saying, like, I could demand that my child obey me because I have power over them. Or the government says I have to do this because they have power over me. Jesus is saying, that's not what this is about. I'm not doing it that way. You're obeying me because you love me. So I would say it this way, because I make 3 observations here that I think will help us. And here's the first. Right? If we're gonna love Jesus by obeying Jesus, then essentially what he's saying is our obedience is an expression of our love. Everybody familiar with this saying, actions speak louder than words. Why is that? Why do you think that is? Let's say you have a friend. They really good friend, and they say, let's do lunch, and then they don't show up. They don't call you, they text you later, oh, I totally forgot, sorry. Then it happens again. Then it happens again. Then you're moving, and they say, oh, I'll be there to help you, but they don't show up, they don't help you. And the next time they see you, they say, oh, you mean so much to me. You're my best friend. I love you so much. What would you be thinking? Yeah, right. Okay? Because actions speak louder than words. In other words, it doesn't really matter what they say because their actions are not lining up with what they say. The one who tells their spouse that they love them, but then don't listen, doesn't help, acts selfishly, and spends all their time on themselves is saying what they really love. And by the way, Jesus doubles down on this. This is just a one-time thing. Just a couple sentences later, he says, whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. In other words, the one who loves me, they're the ones who understands what I want from them and does it. In other words, everything I've been saying for 3 years, that's what I want you to do. Now, this implies you need to know the commands, right? Whoever knows them has them. But knowledge alone is not enough. You could know every single thing Jesus ever did, and he says, look, if you're not doing any of it, you don't love me. John, actually the guy who wrote this and was there, he was at the end, and he was recording all that. He actually recorded the words of Jesus in a later letter. He said this. He said, this is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome. Which, by the way, then brings us to the crux of the question. If Jesus says, the one who loves me will obey my commands, then isn't the logical question, so what commands are we talking about? Right? Isn't that what we'd want to know? If loving Jesus is obeying his commands, then what commands exactly is he talking about? Is he talking about the 10 Commandments? Is he talking about everything in the Bible? Is he talking, what exactly is he talking about here? Thankfully, Jesus was crystal clear on this as well. Because we're like, well, what is it? I don't understand. And I can picture the disciples saying, okay, I think I get this, but I'm not totally sure. And so Jesus goes on, same thing. He's still in the same end of his life saying. He says this, as the Father has loved me, so I've loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain in my love. In other words, there's a connection here between obedience and love. Just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. So he kind of sets, guys, this is serious, is what I'm telling you. And then he says, and my command is this. In other words, think of what he's just done. He says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And here is my command. And I just wonder, like, did he pause? Like, was there kind of something dramatic here where the disciples kind of leaning in, like, what are you talking about? You know what he said? Love others as I loved you. Seems pretty simple. But Jesus is saying something very, very profound, and it impacts what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks, and it's simply this. Obedience to God is connected to loving others. You cannot separate these two things. You cannot say, I love God and not love others. Jesus says, if you do that, you're not obeying my commands and you don't love me. And you all know this because people say, well, it's not God that I have a problem with, it's his people. Right? We've all heard that, right? The hardest thing to deal with is people. Jesus knew that. The Pharisees made this mistake because they took the rules of the law, they followed everything in it, they said everything they had to do, they did everything they had to do, they followed everything, what sins to avoid, what not to do, how often to read their Bibles. And Jesus said, you guys are lost because you have no clue and you're not loving the people around you. You cannot go through life saying, these are the sins I'm going to avoid, here's how I'm going to do all the right things, and think you're being a good follower of Jesus if you're not loving others. When I grew up, anybody know the 1982 Adam Ant song, Goody Goody Two Shoes? Anybody know that song, right? And the chorus is, don't drink, don't smoke, what you going to do, right? It's all focused on outside behavior, right? Some of you are nodding. Some of you listen to the radio, right? And I wonder, like in the 1970s, I would have added, growing up, don't drink, don't smoke, don't go to the movies, don't play cards, etc., etc., etc. That's how you loved Jesus. And if we did the list today, we'd add some other things, take some away. We'd have a whole list. And yet Jesus is saying, look, the sentiment is still wrong. It's not that sin doesn't matter. That's not the point, because when we're pursuing God, we still deal with all those things. But he's saying, look, if you want to love me, if you want to do what I command, then love other people. Remember, we're going to go back. John, the same guy, wrote again in his letter. He said this, dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we have confidence before God. Remember, you can just picture John remembering this conversation because it's almost the same words. And receive from him anything we ask because we keep his commands and do what pleases him. In other words, we have God's love. We're connected. We love him because we're doing what he tells us to do. And this is his command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he commanded us. Jesus was not fuzzy about this. He didn't tell us to occasionally go do some good things. He was so clear. He says, look, I want you to love other people. And by the way, if you don't know what that looks like, just do for them what I did for you. That's your job. And we're going to dig into this, but let's just think of it this way, and we're going to talk about it in communion in a moment. Jesus left everything he had for us. He invested and sacrificed comfort for us. He modeled the Father in heaven for us. He chose us. He did not shy away from us in our sins. He did not throw shame on us. He spoke truth and grace. He died in agony for us. And Jesus said, you just watch me do all that. Go do that. That's it. That's what distinguishes this kind of obedience from legalism, because legalism says, what do I have to do to make God love me? This kind of obedience says, Jesus loved me so much, this is what I have to do for others. That's actually what Jesus said when he left. He said, look, very end of the age, if you remember in Matthew, wow, there we go. What was going on there? If you remember in Matthew, just before he left, right, the last part, he said, I want you to go make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and doing what? Teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And I will be with you always. What did I just command you? Love one another the way I loved you. We cannot make disciples without obedience to this command. The entire purpose of this church and what we're talking about the next 3 weeks is what are we doing to make disciples? How are we going to do that with the people who are already here and with the people who don't yet know Jesus? We cannot do that if we are not living in obedience to everything that He's calling us to do, which means investing our lives in loving other people. Now, what does that look like? There's a lot of detail in that we're going to talk about. But the logic is simply this. If you love me, you're going to obey my commands. And in order to fulfill my mission to make disciples, to teach them to obey those same things, then you have to do it. So here's the thing you're going to learn, and we're going to talk about this year is, obedience is the pathway to growth. God's invitation to a greater relationship comes through greater obedience. If you say, I want to know Jesus better, then do you know what you need to do? Obey Him more. Go more deep. You cannot do it any other way. You will not get it through knowledge. You will not get it through study. If you really want to get close to Jesus, He says, if you want this, then just follow me. By the way, you guys all intuitively know this, don't you? Think of the greatest lessons you've ever learned in your life where you got really close to God. What were you doing at the time? You were stepping out in faith and following Him. Because even when we're to be reading our Bibles, we're to be digging in and hearing from Him and doing it. We want to soak in all that stuff. It's so important. It needs to be vital to everything we do. But then that's supposed to translate into, well, what do I do next with that? Think about it. You read a verse in the Bible that talks about how God is the owner of everything, and we're just His stewards. And we're supposed to be generous with the people who are down and out. And you're learning all this. You're like, yes, God is in charge. And then God says, I want you to take all that money you were going to put into a car and I want you to give it away. And we go, oh, that's a little hard. God's like, yeah, but that's how you're going to love them the way I loved you. So give it up. Do this instead. And if you've ever done this, where you then listen and say, God, I don't want to do this. This is really hard, but I'm going to obey you, and you obey, what happens every single time? Your relationship with God has changed. You're like, oh, it's amazing. I got to see what He was doing. I got to see how He worked, and look what it did for me. And it's like Jesus saying, exactly. That's why obedience is the pathway to growth. I won't read this whole part here, but John says here when he was writing this letter in verse 5, if anyone obeys His word, then love for God is truly made complete in him. And that's how we know we're in Him, that whoever claims to live in Him must live as Jesus did. Not only is our obedience how we grow, it's how we make disciples. Jesus said, look, you spent 3+ years with me watching what I do. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want to teach other people. I loved you, you love others, and you'll make them disciples of me too. It's not complicated, but it's hard. And so we're coming to the communion table this morning. As people who want to grow and who want to make disciples of others. We cannot disciple other people into that which we are not doing ourselves. If you are not living in obedience, if I am not living in obedience, then I have no authority and no power to lead other people into the same. Our obedience to God is blocked by a number of things. And these are the things I want you to be considering as we come up in a moment for communion. Sometimes it's blocked because we're just not listening. I know people say, oh, I'll do whatever God tells me if He just tells me. And then they get so busy and they never talk to God and they never hear Him. Well, God's not telling me to do anything, so I guess I'm good. Maybe you need to listen. Sometimes it's blocked because of selfishness. Because we're like, no, it's my time, it's my resources. I'm like, you don't understand, I'm so busy. This is me time, this is my time. It's the cry of our generation, and we miss out on obedience. Sometimes it's fear. Because we think, if I obey and do what I think God is asking me to do, I'm going to look stupid. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to lose something in this. Sometimes it's pride. Because it'll just mean we don't look as good. We'll have to admit we're wrong when we think they're more wrong than we are. I don't know what it is. Obedience means taking a risk because Jesus never guaranteed what the results of our obedience will look like. What He did guarantee was, if you obey me, we will love each other more and I will be with you.